Um, my name is Marjorie O'Toole. I'm the executive director of the Little Compton Historical Society. I am very pleased tonight to welcome my coworker, Jenna Magnuski, as our speaker. Jenna is our museum educator. As of April 1st, she's actually celebrating her first anniversary with us as a year-round museum educator, and we're so happy to have her on staff. But Jenna is actually also celebrating 15 years with us, the same as me, because she came to me that very first summer as a college student, wondering if there would be an internship for her. And she's been with us off and on ever since, and we're thrilled to have her as part of the team. Jenna has a bachelor's in history. She also has a master's degree in higher education, and she's currently pursuing her second master's degree in public history. Tonight, she's going to be presenting The Road to Suffrage. And when you see her first slide, please read The Road to Suffrage carefully, because it's very clever. And her talk tonight folds together lots of work, a year's worth of work that she did on the Women's History Project, work that she's been doing for her graduate course, a program that she developed for the local Brownie troupe at their request, and also quite a bit of original research. So I can't wait to learn more about Rhode Island and Little Compton's path or road to suffrage. And please join me in welcoming Jenna Magnuski. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry, Jenna is welcoming questions tonight. The way that we handle questions is we ask you to type them into the chat feature for Zoom. And I would like you to please send your question to me, to Marjorie O'Toole, and then I will relay them to Jenna. We've found that it's very hard for the speaker to speak and monitor questions. So I'm going to be the question monitor tonight. All right. All right. Thank you, Jenna. Take it away.
All right. So characteristically, I have too many windows open. There we go. Okay. So as Marjorie said, I'm covering the change in suffrage from the colonial era to the present. So I bit off a very big chunk for myself. In the middle, there's going to be a big focus on the women's suffrage movement. And I'll generally say woman suffrage because that's what they used. We would say women's, they said woman. And also you'll hear me call the women and men that were working for suffrage suffragists instead of suffragettes. And that's because suffragette was actually developed later in the movement as a derogatory term for militant British suffragists. So that being said, we're going to start all the way back at the beginning. And it starts with Rhode Island officially getting its royal charter. So prior to this, we had been kind of floating on the edges, sort of Massachusetts, sort of not. And this charter gave Rhode Island an independent existence from Massachusetts. But at this point, Little Compton was still part of Massachusetts. We changed later. So you can see this is a very ceremonial document, by the grace of God, the king, that sort of thing. And one of the things that they say is that these elected officials are elected or deputed by the majority of the freemen. And that's a word that would have been very familiar to someone then and didn't really need to be defined. So for our purposes, what is a freeman? A freeman is a person who owns a significant amount of land. And one really important thing about the Royal Charter is that you couldn't amend it for any reason, but for our purposes, for voting rights, and that ends up becoming really restrictive later on. Go back for just a second. We go through the revolution and we don't bother making a state constitution separate. We just kind of continue on with the royal charter. And so in 1822, this idea of a freeman is redefined in the Rhode Island state laws. They insert the word white into the definition of freeman. And this prompts the organizing of the free Black community, which is very small at this point, but really didn't necessarily have a lot of cohesion in terms of social advocacy for themselves. And in the Richmond family genealogy, Joshua Richmond places the blame for inserting the word white into the statutes on Isaac Wilbour. So Isaac Wilbour is, from very early on in his life, he's in the Rhode Island General Assembly. He becomes the speaker, lieutenant governor, then governor, associate justice of the Rhode Island Supreme Court, and then chief justice. So this is a very influential person, because I know that somebody at some point will ask, he is the grandson of Dr. William Wilbour, who added the first major addition to the Wilbour house. So that's how he's kind of connected to the family where the Wilbour house is located. And this was really part of a whole lot of race-related laws that were coming out then. Another one that Rhode Island passed in 1822 was an anti-miscegenation law, so that you couldn't have marriage between a white person and someone who then would have been called either a Negro or an Indian. So this was something that was changing, but they also added a whole lot of other things. And Connecticut also restricted what kind of part of a bigger thing. So, well, specifically, maybe it was Isaac Wilbour. I wasn't able to confirm, but he was not the only one. He was part of a general movement there. So in 1660, we're talking about very sparsely populated farm communities. So most men would have been freeholders anyway. Nominally, until 1822, that included freemen of color, but those were exceedingly rare. So the 1663 Royal Charter is designed with exactly that type of community in mind. And privilege is seen, voting is a privilege that was for those who had an economic stake in the community. It wasn't seen as a social right like we would conceive of it now. By the time 1840 comes around, we have these vital urban industrial centers, and we have a lot of immigrants coming in. So in the 1663 charter, four folks are representing Providence and 2 folks are representing Little Compton. And then the Industrial Revolution happens, and now everything is totally unbalanced in terms of the power in the state. Despite the revolution, we didn't get any new constitution. So now instead of most white males being able to vote, we're down to 40% of white males. And it's increasingly talked about by advocates as, the responsibility of a man as the head of a household. So not necessarily the economic stake, but the household focus. And the reason I compared it to 1840 is because we have what's called the Dorr Rebellion usually in textbooks. Frederick Douglass called it the Dorr Excitement, which I love. Some people called it a war, but they had 2 armies that never seemed to find each other out on the battlefield, and only one person died, and it was a person that was shot on accident. So I'm going to step away from war, but they, a group of people created a people's constitution that William Dorr was elected to the governorship of. So we had 2 governments in Rhode Island, and this was a populist government, and they granted citizenship and voting rights to any white male over 21 who had lived in the state for a year. So this is very broad, would have included immigrants especially was very relevant, but also people who didn't own land. So if you were living in a city, you didn't have, a huge farm. And so people that were city dwellers were often excluded as well. So Dorr ends up being run out of the state. He hides out with the governor of New Hampshire for a bit before he ultimately comes back. They sentence him to hard labor. Ultimately, it ends up getting deferred and then pardoned. But a lot of that kind of happens at the same time as the Civil War. So for a long time, people talked about the Dorr Rebellion as a mini Civil War. But it prompts the Rhode Island establishment government to actually get around to writing a constitution. So we're looking at about 50 plus years after the Revolution, Rhode Island finally writes a state constitution. And they grant citizenship to people who are domestically born or who are naturalized if they've lived in the state for a year and have $134 in property, or domestically born in the state for 2 years, and you could either pay a $1 poll tax or serve in the militia. So if you were a immigrant of means, then you could vote. Or if you were a Rhode Island born and raised person, you could be a poor person as long as you had met some other requirements. Technically, this returned voting to free Black men and added immigrants. It accepted Narragansett tribal members and those who are convicted of crimes. And when you read the actual text of how they exclude the Narragansett, it is very, it's racialized. So they're talking about no pauper, lunatic, person non-compos mentis, so incapable of decisions, person under guardianship, or member of the Narragansett tribe. So if you're unable to make a decision for any variety of reasons, or if you're a Narragansett. So, that really gives you a good look at how they thought of the Narragansett at this point. I thought it was interesting that they did not mention the Wampanoag. I'm not exactly sure why. My guess is that there was not a significant population of those of that tribe in Rhode Island, but I'm guessing that Marjorie can give us a better view on that afterwards. One thing to keep in mind is that the ballots at this point aren't secret. So a person of color might be able to vote, but they can also have ramifications based on who they voted for, because people all know who they're voting for. And the property requirements that are in here go away in 1856, but they maintain a poll tax for a very long time. So that's the state of men voting. So let's move now to the state of women. This is a picture of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she becomes a very prominent suffragist. See, now I did it to myself, the suffragist. But the way that she's looking in this camera at this point really stood out to me. She talked about the lack of rights for women. You couldn't decide when and how to have children. You couldn't make money of your own. You couldn't have your own property. So she actually referred to marriage as civil death, which seems extreme. And she's very much like she would have probably fit in pretty well with second wave feminists in terms of the profoundly independent streak in her. She would have stood out for some other reasons, which we'll get to in a couple minutes. So the women get together in Seneca Falls, New York. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and a couple of other early suffragists. And what's really notable here is that they describe the elective franchise as an inalienable right. So no longer is it being described as a privilege, but as a right. And they're upending gender roles, sort of. So at this point, women were expected to commit to domesticity and motherhood. These women were going out in public to have a meeting about their public lives, speaking in public, and to their great surprise, men also come to the meeting, which speaking in mixed audiences is an even greater challenge to those roles. So we look at that now and are like, what's the big deal? But for them, this was a huge change. Most historians now would recognize this as the beginning of the women's suffrage movement. And one reason that it might have had so much purchase is that it was attended by Frederick Douglass. He covered the event in the North Star, which gave it a much greater visibility. And he actually signed the Declaration of Sentiments. And what's interesting is that when they published them, they published the women's names on the top and the men's names underneath, which is kind of another subtle subversion, the women leading in that. Paulina Wright Davis is a woman that was really inspired by this. She had previously been doing a lot of women's work. She was a New Yorker by birth, but she married a Rhode Islander. So we claim partial credit for Paulina Wright Davis. And the National Women's Rights Convention that they held in Worcester is seen as the start of the movement by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton didn't put too much stock in what I had just talked about. She sees this as the true launching forward. But Paulina Wright Davis was a really interesting woman on her own. She was widowed young, was independently wealthy, and decided she was going to go get some medical education, and then basically did sex education in parlors for other women so that they kind of had more control over their bodies. So she, like a lot of other women, are doing women's rights work, but aren't necessarily until this point really coalescing around the idea of women's suffrage. And when she looked back on what the situation was like in 1850, she said that just thinking about going back to it was like soul murder. So we've definitely got the big dramatic statements between civil death and soul murder going on. She actually had petitioned also in 1848, when she was still living in New York, to have women be able to retain their property even after they were married. Another really interesting Rhode Island woman is a New Greenwich woman named Anna Wady Spencer. She was acknowledged as the first women's rights newspaper in the United States. So as all of these abolitionist papers are proliferating, she's looking at it and saying, well, where's ours? So she writes in the first edition that's published, the wrongs will continue until women demand their redress. Who better than herself can press that demand? So she's really seeing it as women standing up for women. And this lasts for about 2 years before it ends up fizzling out. And then the Civil War approaches and ultimately arrives. And with this, the unrest, people are really pushing, do we focus on women's rights? Do we focus on Black rights? Is there some middle ground? How do we figure this out? It was actually a Rhode Island man. His last name is Downing. His first name is evading me at the moment. But he asked Elizabeth Cady Stanton, if you had to choose women's rights or Black suffrage rights, which one would you choose? And she gave kind of a demure sort of like, well, they're both important. We're all just working together kind of a statement. And he pressed her. He said, no, what if you had to pick one, which one would you do first? And she said that she felt really strongly that the influx of less refined, lower class immigrant men needed to be balanced out by having the middle and upper class women able to vote first. And between that and some rivals of either anti-suffragists or anti-Black suffragists come together and put wedges between the movement, and it ultimately ends up that this group that had kind of started, a lot of them as abolitionists, were not as compatible anymore because some lines were drawn. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, rather than kind of backing off of that, as time goes on, really doubles down on racist and xenophobic, what we would say are racist and xenophobic comments then. And I think it's a good reminder that even people who were amazing were also subject to the prejudices of their time. So if she's in this very nativist stew, it would be really hard to not pick that up at some level. She leaned into it a lot. And there's actually a lot of debate about both her and Susan B. Anthony regarding race. But for a brief while, right before the Civil War ends, they have the American Equal Rights Association. So this is Lucretia Mott, who is a white Quaker woman, Frederick Douglass, who is a self-emancipated, formerly enslaved person. And they're all kind of working together, and ultimately it falls apart because they agree that this needs to be talked about, but the women's suffrage people really wanted to focus more on that and just a little bit about Black suffrage. And Frederick Douglass was upset at a particular meeting because he thought it focused too much on women's suffrage and not enough on Black suffrage. So it ends up tearing itself apart. Elizabeth Buffum Chase is another Rhode Islander. She lives in Cumberland for a while, and she is one of those abolitionists turned suffragists. She's a mother of 10 and an Underground Railroad conductor while also doing all this other work. So she's like the original Pinterest mom that's somehow able to do everything. But she co-founded the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association with Paulina Wright Davis. So a couple months prior, there was a New England Suffrage Association that was founded, and then it kind of individually sized down over time. And they start making these petitions to change the Rhode Island Constitution. So this is a first one that was sent just by Elizabeth Buffum Chase in 1867, but as part of the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association, they start sending them every year in 1868. Finally, in 1885, they convinced the legislators to put it to a vote on the House floor. And it passed the House, but it failed the Senate on a technicality. So the next session, the next year, they get it through both chambers of the legislature, and it goes to a referendum to all of the voters in 1887, and it's voted down by 75% to 25%. So, decades of work, and it ends up failing. So they were definitely not people that were easily dissuaded from their beliefs. And ultimately, there's a lot of pressure to focus on Black voting rights. A lot of women who had gone into what were called sanitary commissions, they did a lot of organizing around making sure that soldiers had bandages during the Civil War. They kind of come back. The abolitionists are not as focused on the war itself. Now they're focused on Reconstruction, but all of this energy is going towards Black voting rights. And not all of the suffragists took that very kindly. There was a lot of dissension about it. So when the 15th Amendment was proposed, I had mentioned before, Elizabeth Cady Stanton thought that women should get it first. And ultimately, it tears the movement into two. So you have the American Women's Suffrage Association that's headed by Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, supported the 15th Amendment. Some of them saw it as a stepping stone. Some of them couldn't possibly oppose it because of their past as abolitionists. And they really advocated for a national change in laws and institution to be able to get votes. And they allowed men in leadership. The National Women's Suffrage Association has Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And they thought it was a massive betrayal and that it was a hindrance to, excuse me, to the overall character of the nation. And they advocated a state-by-state strategy. And they were exclusively woman-led. In kind of the separation, Elizabeth Buffum Chase goes to the American Women's Suffrage Association because of her abolitionist ties, and Paulina Wright Davis ends up going to the National Women's Suffrage Association. So this is something that like had ripples down through states and communities as they kind of fell on one side or the other. And that brings us to our lovely Wilbour women. On the left is Sarah Soule Wilbour. On the right is her daughter-in-law, Charlotte B. Wilbour. And they didn't especially align with one or the other. They leaned a little bit more towards ASA, the American Women's Suffrage Association, because Sarah was an abolitionist for many years, and Charlotte was corresponding. She was president of the New York Suffrage Association, and she corresponded freely with both of them, but she appeared regularly in the newspaper for the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was called the Woman's Journal. So in this particular speech that Charlotte was giving, she was really a little bit ahead of her time. So she starts to talk about working women when the movement doesn't get to that until way in the future. But she's talking about, you know, if a woman has to work, she loses rank, she loses caste. But if she can be idle, she's still powerless. And that's still a loss. She's acknowledging the greater oppression of the working woman, but saying it hurts all of us. And she's also part of what's called the New Departure. So these people reread the 14th and 15th Amendments and said, wait, the 14th Amendment says all persons, and aren't I a person who is deserving of rights? So if I'm a person who's deserving of rights, I actually already have the right to vote. We don't need any other amendment. So Susan B. Anthony and a bunch of other women across the country go in and decide they're going to go vote. And a lot of women actually do vote. Susan B. Anthony actually votes, goes home, thinks, oh, nothing came of that. They just let me. Isn't that great? And then later on, a federal marshal comes to your door and very shyly is like, well, Miss Anthony, I have to arrest you and bring you to the court, you know. And the whole time she's complaining, like, well, why aren't you handcuffing me like everybody else? It ends up being overseen by a member of the New York Supreme Court who refuses to jail her, and so she can't raise it up to the United States Supreme Court. So he denies her the ability to continue to challenge it. And a lot of the other women were let go because she was the example case. And then after this, you know, people would go to their clerks and say, oh, but I already have the right to vote. And the town clerk could say back, oh no, Miss Anthony tried that and you don't. So this was something that really got under Susan B. Anthony's skin for a very long time. Sarah Soule Wilbour is kind of hearkening back to an older strain of suffrage, but also, you know, one that continues for a long time. She doesn't want to pay her taxes because she's widowed at this point. She's supposed to be paying taxes, but she doesn't get to vote. And so she is saying, I don't think I should have to pay. She protests later on, she actually refuses. But she's doing this in 1886. And in 1889, she talks about having a suffrage league meeting. So these meetings were continuing, usually monthly, all over the place, in towns, in states, kind of varying levels of size. They read from the Rhode Island law book about the rights of women. And she's acknowledging that they have more rights than they used to. But this idea that the pervasiveness of women's issues is so much that the only thing that's going to fix it is getting the ability to vote. Then the national movement starts looking in different directions. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton is older, and she's really talking about radical independence. You have your right to your own personhood. Whereas Frances Willard, who is the woman on the right and is the president of the Women's Temperance Union, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, is really leaning into a lot of the gender stereotypes, like, oh, we can mother the nation, we can use our moral compass. And so there's kind of a disagreement about which way to head. And Susan B. Anthony Elizabeth Cady Stanton ends up passing away, but so does Frances Willard, because she goes so hard at everything that she dies in her 30s. A really important change, which doesn't necessarily have to do with one group being enfranchised or not, is the adoption of the Australian ballot in 1889. So now we're having secret balloting. So when you think about, people having the right to vote, they can vote, but can they actually vote their conscience? This really allows them to do that at a greater level. And I didn't realize until I did this research that it originated in Australia, so that was fun. And then all across the country, there is this movement towards getting everybody under one big umbrella. So the National Association of Colored Women takes all of these groups that advocate for colored women for Black women in this whole variety of places, some of them suffrage, some of them anti-suffrage, and just puts them into one consolidated place. And so woman suffrage is getting this push towards unifying. So it takes 2 years for them to iron out all of these details, because the American Women's Suffrage Association is much smaller. So how do we know that the National Women's Suffrage Association isn't just going to take us over? There's a lot of very hardened animosities, and it ultimately takes the next generation to make this happen. So the woman on the left is Alice Stone Blackwell, the daughter of Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, and the woman on the right is Harriet Stanton Blatch, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter. So these two women, kind of raised in the suffrage tradition, are able to bridge the gap that their mothers couldn't. And this allows the movement to move forward in a new and more powerful way. Someone that we can, again, kind of claim partial credit for is Florence Kelley. She visited Little Compton a couple of times. Her family, though, later on becomes much more of a regular presence in the summer community. And she's really representative of this idea of the new woman. So they're energetic, they're fine with the good and the bad attention, all of its attention. And Florence Kelley was a woman of means. So she has the money and the standing. She goes off to Switzerland to get her law degree and ends up coming back a socialist who has married a Russian comrade and has a couple of kids. So there's a big life change over in Europe. And she comes back and she's really working on the needs of working women and children. And she actually flees her abusive marriage to go to Hull House, which is a settlement house in Chicago. And the settlement houses were really trying to get more affluent people and lower class, working class people closer together. And they thought that you had to live with them in order to make that happen. So she's living there, her kids are growing up there, and she's going around and doing all of this activism. And at the time it was in vogue, and then it collapses. The bottom drops out from underneath all of the motivation for that movement. And she realizes that the only way to make those changes durable and meaningful is to fight for women's suffrage. So she becomes really involved with now the NASA, National American Women's Suffrage Association. She's in charge of their industrial wing. She's also doing a lot of work still with trade unions, and bringing in those trade unions ends up being a much better calculation. So bringing in women from the trade unions brought in men who wanted their wives to be able to vote. When they tried to bring in temperance before, it actually ended up kind of biting them in the end, because men didn't want to vote for women to get the vote, because then the women would take the alcohol away. So once prohibition happens, that actually gets a little bit easier finally, but it takes it takes some time. And another Rhode Island woman who comes into play is Alva Belmont. So she is she was a Vanderbilt, then married again to Belmont, and she lives in Marble House in Newport. And she was part of Harriet Stanton Blatch saying, hey, instead of trimming our activities based on our budget, why don't we fundraise for the activities that we want to have? So she's really kind of looking at it from a grow into the size of your fishbowl sort of mentality. And so she brings in all these society women. Alva Belmont is only one of a whole cadre of them that they end up pulling in, but she's a really significant person from Rhode Island. After 1909, they start doing things a little bit differently. They start wanting to physically show who they are and the size of their movement. So before they did that with petitions and other like nice and respectable things where I stay in my home, and now they're like, you know, they're a lot more willing to push. And so they start having these parades. They don't want to call it, we would call it a march today. They called it a parade. It was very, you know, everybody had their matching outfits and was very genteel about it. So they start doing them in 1909. There's a really big one in New York in 1912, and finally one that is in DC in 1913. So they see the benefits of it and they kind of keep growing it. The woman on the right is Ida Wells Barnett, and she is more well known for her anti-lynching activism, but she was also an ardent woman suffragist. And as people are stepping out into these parades, they think, oh, well, what if we get dinged because we're inviting Black women? And so they say, listen, Ida, you can march, but you have to go into the back with the other colored women. And Ida does not take that well. She goes storming off, and they think, oh, great, it seems like we've kind of evaded that whole conflict. But then halfway through the parade, she suddenly like bursts in from the side of the road and joins and integrates the Illinois delegation in the rest of the parade. And they thought that there was going to be a lot more pushback. They actually had a National Guard unit on call in case there was a lot of anger about involving the women, the Black women, and it was fine. So they had gotten all out of sorts for nothing. And this woman is the woman who makes this now unified and look at all the great things we're doing sort of group break back apart. So she comes from having been in the British suffragette sort of school, comes back to the United States, and is very much about, you know, the spectacle of everything. And it ends up splitting the entire group into two. So Alice Paul is very much the let's keep shoving their face in it, let's keep pushing them, confronting them. And the National Association of Women's Suffrage, the National Women's Suffrage Association, is looking at it as let's kind of schmooze, let's, you know, massage this, let's debate this. You know, they are much more behind the scenes conciliatory sort of mindset. And so ultimately, like I said, the two groups split, and in the split, Alice Paul gets Alva Belmont. And so you have all of these like very working class level, scrappy sort of suffragists that are hanging out in the Marble House in Newport in 1914. So I imagine the contrast must have been amazing. But the one thing that they do, well, that the National Women's Party, that's the group that Alice Paul comes to lead, and the NASA agree on, is that presidential pressure is everything, because now we need to focus on federal. So different methods, same goal. And so the question was then for these women, are you an Alice Paul who's out there protesting presidential parades, or are you making best friends with Wilson's chief of staff so that you can get audiences more easily? And it's not really clear from this whose method won the day. And I imagine that's why you still have a lot of movements that follow both of those sort of tactics. So what women start to do so that they can better pressure is they start advocating for partial suffrage. So in some places you could do school board service. You could either vote for or serve on the school board. Little Compton was one of those. So our first woman in an elected office was Susan Allen Brownell in 1884, and she was on the school board. So a lot of places would allow women to vote for school boards because that was in a woman's area of educating the children. But presidential suffrage really let you push more. So you can see on this sign in 1917, Rhode Island got presidential suffrage for women. So women couldn't vote for state or municipal or legislative anything. They could only vote for presidential electors. But also while you're there, ask about the amendment so you can keep up that pressure on the president with now the fact that you have a vote. And in 1919, they finally passed the 19th Amendment. And then it has to go to the states, and 36 of the states have to say, yeah, this is a great plan, let's do it. So that takes a long time, but they are determined to get it done before the 1920 presidential election, and they do. Rhode Island is the 23rd state to ratify the amendment. And the interesting thing about the amendment is that it doesn't grant women the right to vote. It says you can't stop someone from voting because they're a woman. And that seems like a weird hair to split, but women were, the voting laws were supposed to be state driven. And so this was a way to say, well, we're not telling the states who can vote. We're just saying who they can't stop from voting. So it was this weird workaround that they had figured out. The last one was Tennessee, which was a surprise. They assumed that they were going to fail there. And there's a lot written about Tennessee because of the fact that they were the last one to push the amendment over the edge into being law. But they thought that they had lost. The legislators in the session were wearing yellow and red roses to indicate whether they were for suffrage or against women's suffrage. And counting the roses, they didn't have enough. And they were going through the roll call, and they get to a man named Henry Byrne. And they're expecting him to say that he opposes the amendment until he pulls a note from his pocket that was from his mama that said, basically, you better give those women their right to vote. And that woman's note is the reason why this man voted for the amendment, which is why women were able to vote in the 1920 presidential election. So for me, that's a really powerful story because it reminds you the fact that even these really small one-to-one interactions with people can have a huge impact on the world. A lot of people are like, great, women got the right to vote in the celebrations, but that's not exactly the way that it worked. So Indigenous citizenship isn't a law. They don't have American citizenship until 1924. So they can't vote until 1924. Poll taxes are finally repealed. In Rhode Island, they get taken out in 1951. But in 1964, a constitutional amendment makes them federally not permissible. In 1952, the Walter McCarran Act makes it so that all federal rules that would stop Asian descended immigrants from being able to become naturalized citizens, they're all nullified. So now they can become citizens and be able to vote. Washington, D.C. doesn't get to vote until 1961 in federal elections, so they can only vote in local elections up to that point. Jim Crow and the Voting Rights Act in 1965 put an end to a lot of discriminatory practices that were keeping African Americans from their right to vote, particularly things like literacy tests. In the 70s, the Voting Rights Act is updated to say that you have to offer different languages so that someone who is not a native English speaker is still able to cast their ballot if they qualify otherwise. 1971, they lower the voting age to 18 with the 26th Amendment. In 1984, they say that you have to make all of your elections accessible for various disabilities. So that's everything from not having your elections take place somewhere with stairs to having someone that will assist a blind person with their vote. And most recently in 2006, Rhode Island restored voting rights after prison. So once you're released from prison, your voting rights get restored in Rhode Island. Others delay it until after you're also done with probation or those sorts of things, but Rhode Island does it as soon as you are released from prison. And today, we continue to have things go on. I think most people think of voting rights as being accomplished with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but that's something that still has to be reauthorized. Parts of it have been challenged in the Supreme Court and struck down. Voter ID in Rhode Island, nationally as well, but in Rhode Island, they say that you can get a voter ID card if you cannot get any other form of ID for whatever reason. And what qualifies to get you that voter ID card is a lot, but I couldn't find anything on the Rhode Island Secretary of State website about who do I actually go to? Who do I bring this to get my voter ID? So you think about some of these ways that get in the way of your right to vote, even if it's not technically barring your right to vote. There's debate going on about Georgia right now and voting hours. And the question of, with COVID, so many more people were able to vote because of 24-hour drop boxes. So do we keep that going, knowing that it amplifies the voice of the people, or do we not? And I will end there and take a nice big sip of water because my voice is going crazy, and see if Marjorie has any questions for me.
Yes, I've been seeing some questions come in. So let me go to the chat. And so the first question that came in, the slew of racist laws that were passed in the 1820s in Rhode Island, were they part of a larger movement in the United States or perhaps just in the North?
Yes. So the 1882 removing the right to vote and intermarriage laws were something that was kind of sweeping the United States, but especially Connecticut had just passed a similar law immediately prior that redefined freemen. So it was something that was using that particular strategy of redefining things was pretty common.
Any idea how much $1 in 1843 would translate into in today's money? I believe that was in reference to the $1 poll tax.
Yes. I should have looked this up beforehand. Give me 1 second. Let's go to the handy dandy inflation calculator and see. Oh, this one only goes back to 1913, but in 1913, $1 is the equivalent of almost $27. And then you got to think, you're making it that much further back. So it was not, an inconsequential cost for sure.
And then going back even further to the time of freeholders, can you quantify what a significant amount of land might have meant, or what was considered insignificant?
Right. They quantified it as you needed to have land that was of a value of 40 pounds or greater. I'm not sure if you can put that into greater context in terms of how much would 40 pounds have bought you in Little Compton?
Yeah, and that would change from time to time. At times, you seriously could get an acre of land for £1. So you're talking at perhaps a 30 or 40 acre farm. So that was pretty significant. Interesting. Was coverture, or perhaps you can define coverture, and then was coverture part of the suffrage movement discussion?
Absolutely. So coverture or coverture is this idea that when a woman marries, everything, you basically get transferred from, the legal responsibility of the father transfers to the husband. So when you think about being given away at weddings, it becomes a whole lot less romantic when you think about it in terms of coverture. But you were seen as becoming one as an entity with your husband. So a really good explanation of that I've heard is like rivers. So you're a tributary and you join your husband's river. So you can't separate out what came from the tributary and what came from the original river. So when Elizabeth Cady Stanton was talking about civil debt, she's talking about the fact that I can't own anything. I can work, but my money just goes to my husband. Like, I don't actually have anything that's mine. And she and Paulina Wright Davis in 1848, one of the things that they were doing was making it so that women kept their property after marriage in New York State. That was something that had to be challenged piecemeal.
And we certainly welcome additional questions. If anyone has one, just a reminder, we're asking you to type it into the chat feature and direct it to me. But there is at least one more, and you're getting some lovely compliments too here, Jenna. A question regarding religion in Rhode Island. In 1762, Rhode Island denied citizenship to Aaron Lopez, a Jewish merchant from Newport. Do you have a sense of when religious restrictions were removed from voting in Rhode Island?
So that's interesting. When they were talking about freedom of religion, mostly in Rhode Island, they were talking about freedom of various flavors of Christianity largely. Rhode Island was more friendly to Jewish immigrants, but I'm not sure when they changed, when that particular restriction both came into play and when it came out of play, but I'll have to look for it. That's a really good question.